When Colonel Bridger told my sister Vera she'd never make it past the first day of Navy SEAL training, he had no idea he was staring at the woman who would rewrite military history. What happened next still gives me chills, even 2 years later. Before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. I'm talking about my younger sister, Vera Caldwell. At 28, she stood barely 5'6" and weighed 130 pounds, soaking wet. But behind those calm green eyes was a tactical mind that had earned her 2 Bronze Stars in Afghanistan and a reputation as one of the Army's most brilliant intelligence officers. The brass saw her size and immediately wrote her off. They had no idea what they were dealing with. The setting was Fort Braxton Special Operations Training Facility in North Carolina, March of 2023. The air was thick with tension and skepticism as 12 women reported for the most controversial military experiment in decades, the Joint Special Operations Integration Program. These weren't just any female soldiers. These were the absolute elite, handpicked from thousands of applicants to prove whether women belonged alongside Navy SEALs, Green Berets, and Force Recon Marines. Colonel Marcus Bridger stood at the front of the briefing room, his weathered face carved from 52 years of military service. His gray eyes had seen 3 wars, and his voice carried the authority of someone who'd never been questioned. When he looked at the female candidates that first morning, his expression said everything. These women were an inconvenience, a political experiment he'd been forced to oversee, but it was what happened when his gaze landed on Vera that changed everything. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She met his stare with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove to herself, only to him. In that moment, I knew my sister was about to do something extraordinary. As her older brother and a military journalist assigned to document this integration program, I had a front row seat to watch Vera face the biggest challenge of her military career. I'd seen her overcome doubters before, but nothing like this. The entire future of women in special operations hung in the balance, and somehow it all came down to my little sister who used to climb trees in our backyard, determined to go higher than any of the neighborhood boys. The disbelief in Colonel Bridger's voice when he made that comment about her not lasting a day wasn't just casual dismissal. It was the sound of a man who had built his entire worldview around the belief that some battles were simply too big for certain people to fight. He was about to learn just how wrong he could be. What Vera accomplished in the weeks that followed didn't just shock the military establishment. It fundamentally changed how we think about strength, strategy, and what it really means to be a warrior. This is the story of how my sister proved that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one everyone underestimates. Fort Braxton sprawled across 300 acres of North Carolina pine forest, its red brick buildings and concrete training facilities designed to forge America's most elite warriors. In March 2023, those grounds became the stage for the most politically charged military experiment in decades. The Joint Special Operations Integration Program wasn't just about training. It was about proving whether the last masculine fortress in the military could finally open its doors to women. Vera had arrived 3 days early, as she always did for important missions. I found her in the base coffee shop at 5:30 that first morning, already studying training manuals with the same intensity she'd once applied to intelligence briefings in Kabul. Her auburn hair was pulled back in the regulation bun, but I could see the slight tremor in her hands as she turned the pages. My little sister was nervous, though she'd never admit it. "You know you don't have to prove anything to anyone," I told her, sliding into the booth across from her. "You've already served with more distinction than most of these guys ever will." She looked up from her manual, those green eyes that had always been too serious for her face. "That's where you're wrong. I have to prove everything to everyone. Again." Her voice carried the weight of every military evaluation, every fitness test, every moment she'd had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. Vera's journey to this moment began 28 years ago, when our father, Master Sergeant James Caldwell, decided his daughter deserved the same physical training as his son. While other girls were learning dance routines, Vera was doing push-ups in our garage. Dad never made distinctions between us, but the world certainly did. When I excelled at something, people called me naturally gifted. When Vera achieved the same standard, they said she was trying too hard. West Point had been her first real proving ground. She graduated summa cum laude with a degree in Middle Eastern Studies and a minor in psychology. While her male classmates partied on weekends, Vera studied Arabic, Pashto, and Farsi. She understood that being good wouldn't be enough. She had to be extraordinary. Afghanistan changed her. 3 deployments as an intelligence officer had given her a perspective that classroom training never could. She'd interrogated Taliban commanders, analyzed terrorist networks, and provided tactical intelligence that saved countless American lives. The Bronze Stars weren't ceremony prizes. They represented real missions where her analysis had been the difference between life and death. But none of that mattered to the instructors at Fort Braxton. When Vera walked into that first briefing, she wasn't Master Sergeant Caldwell's daughter or the intelligence officer who'd cracked terrorist cells in Kandahar. She was just another woman trying to do a man's job. The other 11 female candidates came from equally impressive backgrounds. There was Captain Riley Hendricks from the Air Force, a pilot who'd flown combat missions over Syria. Staff Sergeant Zara Voss had been an Army Ranger instructor before women were officially allowed in the program. Each woman carried her own collection of achievements and her own burden of expectations. What set Vera apart wasn't her resume, it was her approach to pressure. Where others saw the weight of representing all women in combat roles, Vera saw a tactical problem to be solved. She'd learned in Afghanistan that surviving meant adapting, not conforming. The question wasn't whether she could do what the men did. The question was whether she could do it better using her own methods. The night before official training began, she called our parents. Dad's voice cracked with pride when she described the upcoming challenges. Mom, who'd spent 30 years as a military spouse watching other people's children get opportunities her daughter was denied, simply said, "Show them who you really are." That conversation revealed everything about Vera's mindset. She wasn't trying to prove she belonged. She already knew she belonged. She was there to show everyone else what they'd been missing by keeping women out of special operations. The doubt wasn't about her abilities. The doubt was about whether the military was ready to acknowledge what she'd always known about herself. As I watched her prepare for the most challenging 8 weeks of her life, I realized this wasn't just about integration or equal opportunity. This was about my sister finally getting the chance to operate at her full potential, without anyone telling her to hold back or tone it down or be more like everyone else. The announcement came during week 3 of training, delivered with Colonel Bridger's characteristic bluntness. Ladies and gentlemen, your final evaluation will be a head-to-head competition. The top-performing female candidate will face our best Navy SEAL team in a simulated hostage rescue mission. Winner takes all. The room went dead silent. Vera's face remained perfectly composed, but I saw her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. This wasn't just another training exercise. This was trial by combat, with the entire future of women in special operations hanging in the balance. Chief Petty Officer Kane Morrison's reaction was immediate and predictable. The SEAL team leader leaned back in his chair with a smirk that screamed arrogance. "Sir, with all due respect, my team hasn't lost a training exercise in 2 years. Seems like we're setting these ladies up for disappointment." Morrison commanded Alpha Team, 4 Navy SEALs who moved through training scenarios like a perfectly calibrated machine. They were fast, aggressive, and devastatingly effective. More importantly, they'd made it clear from day one that they resented having to share their training space with women. Morrison's comment to his teammates after that first briefing had spread through the base like wildfire. "I've seen her type before. All book smarts, no battlefield instincts. This'll be over in 20 minutes. The psychological warfare began immediately. During shared training sessions, Morrison's team would finish obstacle courses and then stand around commenting loudly about technique and stamina. They'd offer unsolicited advice about equipment modifications and suggest lighter weapon loads. Every interaction carried the subtext that the women were playing in a league they didn't belong in. Vera absorbed it all without reaction, but I could see the toll it was taking. She'd always been lean, but now she was gaunt. The 8-week program had pushed every candidate to their physical limits, but the women faced an additional burden. They weren't just competing against the standards, they were competing against decades of institutional skepticism. The breaking point came during a 20-mile forced march with full gear. It was day 62 of the program, and Vera had been running on adrenaline and determination for weeks. I was documenting the exercise from a support vehicle when I saw her stumble, catch herself, and then simply collapse face first into the dirt. The medics rushed to her position while Morrison's team continued past without slowing. I heard one of them mutter, "And there it is." The dismissal in those 4 words contained everything wrong with this entire situation. I found Vera in the medical tent 30 minutes later, hooked to an IV and staring at the canvas ceiling. Her face was flushed with heat exhaustion, but her eyes held something I'd never seen before: defeat. "Maybe they're right," she whispered when she saw me. "Maybe I'm just fooling myself. Maybe some barriers exist for good reasons." This was the sister who'd talked her way into advanced intelligence training when instructors said she was too young. The sister who'd volunteered for dangerous assignments in Afghanistan when others played it safe. Hearing her doubt herself felt like watching gravity reverse itself. But Vera Caldwell had never been one to stay down long. Within hours of her medical clearance, she was back in her quarters with compound blueprints spread across every available surface. While other candidates were sleeping or socializing, Vera was studying floor plans, analyzing sight lines, and memorizing every detail of the mock facility where the final exercise would take place. She approached the mission, planning with the same methodical intensity that had made her legendary in intelligence circles. 18-hour study sessions became her norm. She mapped traffic patterns, identified potential blind spots, and even researched the psychological profiles of the instructors who would be playing terrorist roles. The other candidates thought she was overcomplicating things. Morrison's team was preparing with their usual swagger, confident that superior firepower and aggressive tactics would carry the day. They'd run this type of exercise dozens of times. Speed, violence of action, and overwhelming force were their signatures, but Vera was playing a different game entirely. She'd realized something that would change everything. This wasn't about matching their approach. This was about proving that different didn't mean inferior. She just had to find the courage to trust herself when everyone else was betting against her. The morning of the final exercise arrived gray and cold, with fog rolling across Fort Braxton like a bad omen. I found Vera in the armory at 5 a.m., methodically checking her gear with movements so precise they looked choreographed. She'd been awake for 3 hours already, running final calculations in her head. "You know what the difference is between us and them?" she asked without looking up from her weapon inspection. "They're planning to win. I'm planning not to lose." There's a world of difference between those two mindsets. Something fundamental had shifted in my sister overnight. The doubt that had consumed her after her collapse was gone, replaced by a clarity that reminded me of the intelligence officer who'd unraveled terrorist networks in Kabul. She'd stopped trying to be what everyone expected and started being who she actually was. "I've been approaching this all wrong," she continued, sliding her sidearm into its holster with practiced efficiency. "For 8 weeks, I've been trying to prove I can do what they do. But that's not my strength. My strength is seeing what they can't see." The mission briefing revealed the scenario. 3 hostages held by 5 armed terrorists in a 2-story compound designed to replicate conditions in urban combat zones. Both Vera and Morrison's team would receive identical intelligence packets and have 45 minutes to plan their approach. Success would be measured by speed, stealth, and most importantly, hostage safety. Morrison's planning session was exactly what you'd expect from elite operators. They spread blueprints across a table and immediately began identifying breach points, fields of fire, and movement corridors. Their approach was textbook special operations, explosive entry, suppressing fire, systematic room clearing, overwhelming violence applied with surgical precision. But Vera took her intelligence packet to a quiet corner and did something different. Instead of focusing on the building's physical layout, she studied the psychological profiles of the instructors, playing terrorist roles. These weren't random assignments. The exercise designers had chosen specific people to play specific parts. and Vera was analyzing them like she'd once analyzed actual enemy combatants. Master Sergeant Rodriguez is playing the terrorist leader, she told me during a brief break. I worked with him on interrogation scenarios last year. He's methodical, paranoid, and always has an exit strategy. If this were real, Rodriguez would never allow himself to be trapped on an upper floor with no escape route. While Morrison's team focused on firepower and tactics, Vera was thinking like an intelligence analyst. She cross-referenced Rodriguez's known behavioral patterns with the compound layout, looking for elements that weren't in the official briefing materials. That's when she found it. A notation on the original architectural drawings about basement access tunnels that had been constructed for utility maintenance but never officially documented. The tunnel system wasn't part of the exercise briefing, because it wasn't supposed to be part of the scenario. But Vera understood that the best training exercises mirror real-world conditions, and real buildings have features that don't appear on official floor plans. If Rodriguez was playing a paranoid terrorist leader, he'd know about those tunnels. Her final preparation wasn't physical conditioning or weapons training. It was meditation techniques she'd learned during her intelligence work, methods for maintaining mental clarity under extreme stress. While Morrison's team was psyching themselves up with aggressive motivation, Vera was centering herself in calm focus. The psychological transformation was complete when she approached Morrison's team just before the exercise began. Instead of the nervous energy that had characterized her earlier training, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd already solved the puzzle. "Good luck, gentlemen," she said simply. "May the best soldier win." The casual confidence in her voice visibly unsettled Morrison's team. They'd prepared for desperation, for someone trying too hard to prove herself. They weren't ready for someone who seemed genuinely at peace with whatever was about to happen. Colonel Bridger called both teams to the starting line, his expression skeptical but curious. Pentagon observers settled into their viewing positions, cameras rolling to document what everyone assumed would be a demonstration of male physical superiority in combat operations. But Vera had stopped caring about their expectations. She'd found her own path through the maze of doubt and pressure. Now it was time to show everyone what happened when you stopped trying to be someone else and started being the best version of yourself. At exactly 0800 hours, both teams received their final mission briefing. The compound held 3 civilian hostages, a diplomat, an aid worker, and a journalist. 5 armed terrorists controlled the building, with the leader believed to be holding the primary target on the second floor. Electronic surveillance showed movement in multiple rooms, but exact positions were unclear due to signal interference. Morrison's Alpha team moved like a force of nature. Within 30 seconds of the start, signal, they'd positioned explosive charges against the main entrance and coordinated suppressing fire positions. The blast that followed shook windows 3 buildings away, sending a clear message. The Navy SEALs had arrived and subtlety was not on the agenda. They flowed through the breach like water finding the path of least resistance, their movements synchronized from years of training together. First floor cleared in under 2 minutes. Stairwell secured. 2 hostages located and extracted with textbook precision. Their execution was flawless, aggressive, and exactly what everyone expected from America's most elite warriors. But while Morrison's team was making their dramatic entrance, Vera had already been inside the building for 10 minutes. She'd found the maintenance tunnel entrance exactly where the architectural drawings suggested it would be, behind a utility shed, 200 yards from the main compound. The passage was narrow, dark, and definitely not designed for tactical operations. But it led directly into the basement of the target building, bypassing every defensive position the terrorists had established. Moving through that tunnel required a different kind of courage than charging through explosive breaches. It meant crawling through claustrophobic darkness with no backup, no communication, and no guarantee that her analysis was correct. If she was wrong about Rodriguez's behavioral patterns, she'd emerge into a basement full of armed instructors, with no escape route. But intelligence work had taught her to trust her analysis even when it felt like guesswork. Rodriguez was playing a paranoid terrorist leader, and paranoid leaders always kept escape routes. The basement tunnel wasn't just access, it was his exit strategy. She emerged from the tunnel into a storage room that reeked of diesel fuel and old concrete. The sounds of Morrison's assault filtered down from above, shouting, simulated gunfire, the controlled chaos of a military operation in progress. But the basement was eerily quiet except for the soft sound of someone moving equipment in the adjacent room. Through a crack in the door, Vera saw exactly what she'd predicted. Master Sergeant Rodriguez in full terrorist costume preparing to evacuate with the third hostage through the same tunnel she'd used to enter. He was following his character's logic perfectly, using the chaos upstairs to mask his escape with the most valuable prisoner. What happened next lasted less than 30 seconds but required every skill Vera had developed over her military career. She couldn't use standard breach tactics without risking the hostage's safety. She couldn't call for backup without revealing her position. She had to neutralize an experienced instructor who outweighed her by 80 pounds while protecting a role-playing civilian in a space barely larger than a storage closet. The solution came from her intelligence training, not her combat instruction. Instead of attacking Rodriguez directly, she used misdirection and psychology. A thrown wrench created noise in the opposite corner, drawing his attention away from both her and the hostage. When he turned to investigate, she moved with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this exact scenario in her mind dozens of times. The simulated neutralization was textbook. Approach from the blind spot, control the weapon, use leverage instead of strength. Rodriguez went down with barely a sound, his training vest registering the successful hit before he even realized what had happened. But the real shock came when exercise control called "Mission Complete" over the radio. Morrison's team had secured 2 hostages and believed they'd cleared the building. They emerged from the front entrance expecting congratulations, only to see Vera walking calmly around the corner of the building with the third hostage in tow. The silence that followed was profound. Colonel Bridger's jaw literally dropped. Pentagon observers leaned forward in their chairs. Morrison stared in complete disbelief, his confidence evaporating like morning fog. Vera had completed her mission 7 minutes faster than the Navy SEALs, without firing a shot and using tactics that no one in the observation area had even considered possible. She'd proven that different wasn't just equal. Sometimes different was better. The moment Colonel Bridger approached Vera after the exercise, I knew our family's military legacy had just been rewritten. His weathered face carried an expression I'd never seen from him. Genuine respect mixed with something approaching awe. When he extended his hand, it wasn't the perfunctory gesture of a superior acknowledging a subordinate. It was one warrior recognizing another. "Soldier, I owe you an apology," he said, his gravelly voice carrying across the silent observation area. "You didn't just prove women belong in special operations. You reminded us all what real tactical excellence looks like. That basement approach was brilliant, and I've been doing this for 30 years. But it was Morrison's reaction that truly captured the magnitude of what had just happened. The SEAL team leader stood frozen for nearly a full minute, processing the impossible reality that his elite team had been outmaneuvered by a single soldier using tactics they'd never considered. When he finally approached Vera, his swagger was completely gone. "I underestimated you completely," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. That tunnel approach, the psychological analysis of the terrorist leader's behavior patterns, the way you anticipated Rodriguez's escape route. I've been doing this for 15 years and never would have thought of any of it. You didn't just outfight us, you outthought us at every level." The Pentagon observers were frantically taking notes, realizing they'd just witnessed something that would reshape Special Operations doctrine. General Patricia Hayes, the Defense Department's highest-ranking female officer, stood with tears in her eyes as she watched Vera accept congratulations from soldiers who doubted her existence just hours earlier. Within 72 hours, the Joint Special Operations Integration Program wasn't just continued but massively expanded. Vera became the first woman accepted into a classified Special Operations unit whose name and mission remain redacted from official records. The program that was supposed to prove whether women could handle special operations had instead proven that the military had been operating with artificial limitations for decades. But the personal transformation in Vera was even more profound than the institutional change around her. That evening, As we sat in the base mess hall surrounded by congratulatory soldiers, she finally explained what had shifted in her mindset. For 8 weeks I was trying to be their version of strong, she said, stirring her coffee with hands that were no longer trembling. I was attempting to match their physical capabilities, mirror their aggressive tactics, prove I could be just as loud and forceful as they were. But that was never going to work, because that's not who I am. The breakthrough had come when she realized that her intelligence background wasn't a secondary skill to complement her combat training. It was her primary weapon, more powerful than any physical advantage her competitors possessed. While they were preparing for a firefight, she was solving a puzzle that required analysis, patience, and unconventional thinking. I didn't win because I was as strong as them, she continued. I won because I was brave enough to be myself in a world that told me being myself wasn't enough. The military spent so long telling women we had to be exactly like men to succeed that we forgot we might have something different to offer. 6 months later, Vera's influence had rippled through special operations training programs across all service branches. Her basement approach had been incorporated into standard tactical doctrine. More importantly, her success had opened doors for hundreds of women who'd been waiting for someone to prove it was possible. The letter she received from our father captured the broader significance of her achievement. You didn't just represent our family, he wrote. You represented every military daughter who was told to set more realistic goals, every female soldier who was advised to consider support roles instead of combat positions, every woman who knew she belonged somewhere she wasn't allowed to go. Today, Vera continues serving in ways I cannot discuss publicly, but her legacy lives on in every woman who now has the opportunity to compete without artificial barriers. She'd proven that the greatest victory isn't defeating your opponents using their methods. The greatest victory is succeeding so completely using your own methods that everyone has to acknowledge they'd been thinking about the problem wrong. Sometimes changing the world requires refusing to let other people define your limitations. Sometimes it requires being brave enough to show everyone what they'd been missing by keeping you out of the room.